In the Crystal Kingdom, the Dragon Empire of Valdoria stretched across 3 continents, its cities carved from living gemstones that pulsed with ancient magic. At the heart of this magnificent realm stood the Sapphire Palace, home to the royal family whose bloodline had ruled for 5,000 years. The dragons of Valdoria were breathtaking creatures, their scales shimmering in colors that shifted with their emotions, their wings capable of creating storms with a single beat. They were powerful, proud, and deeply bound by tradition. Prince Casimir was the empire's greatest secret and shame. Born 22 years ago under a blood moon, he had never uttered a single sound. Not a cry at birth, not a word in childhood, not a decree in preparation for his future throne. The physicians examined him repeatedly and found his voice perfectly formed. The priests performed countless rituals and found no curse upon his soul. The scholars studied him for years and found his mind sharper than any blade. Yet Casimir remained silent, his golden eyes watching the world with an intensity that unnerved even his own father, Emperor Theron, whose crimson scales marked him as the most powerful dragon in 3 generations, paced the throne room with barely contained fury. His massive form cast shadows across the assembled council members, each one trembling despite their own considerable power. The tapestries depicting 1,000 years of imperial glory seemed to mock him with their grand speeches and legendary proclamations. 22 years, Theron's voice rumbled like distant thunder. My son approaches the age of coronation, and he has never spoken. How can he rule an empire if he cannot voice the sacred oaths? How can he command our armies if he cannot issue orders? How can he inspire our people if he gives them only silence? The council members shifted uncomfortably. They had witnessed this outburst before, in various forms, over many years. High Priestess Morgana, her violet scales dulled with age, finally spoke. Your Majesty, we have exhausted every resource within our realm. Perhaps it is time to consider looking beyond our borders. You suggest seeking help from lesser beings? The Emperor's tail slammed against the marble floor, cracking it. The humans and their weak forms? The crystal folk with their fragile bodies? What could they possibly offer that our greatest minds have not? Different perspectives, Your Majesty, Morgana persisted gently. The humans in particular have developed remarkable ways of communication for those who cannot speak. Their adaptability is legendary across the known worlds. After a long silence filled only with the Emperor's heavy breathing, he finally nodded. Send for someone discreet. I will not advertise our weakness to the world. Find a human who can help my son, or find none at all. The girl in the garden 15,000 miles away, in the human settlement of Riverbend nestled at the edge of dragon territory, Sienna Blackwood knelt in the dirt, her hands deep in rich soil. At 27 years old, she had long ago accepted that her life would be spent among plants rather than people. Her father had been the royal gardener before his death, and she had inherited both his position and his cottage on the palace grounds. Most people found Sienna strange. She rarely spoke unless necessary, preferring the quiet company of growing things. What they did not know was that Sienna communicated constantly, just not with words. Her hands moved in intricate patterns as she worked, a private language she had developed as a child when words felt too heavy, too complicated, too likely to be misunderstood. She had learned this way of moving her hands from her grandmother, who had been born deaf. The old woman had taught Sienna that communication was more than sound, that meaning could flow through gesture and expression just as clearly as through speech. After her grandmother passed, Sienna had continued developing the language, creating signs for concepts that had no words, emotions that defied description. The other servants whispered about her. They called her the mute girl, though Sienna could speak perfectly well when she chose tea. Oh, they avoided her cottage at the edge of the palace gardens, spreading rumors that she practiced strange magic among the flowers. Sienna did not mind. The plants never judged, never demanded explanations, never misunderstood. She was deadheading roses when the imperial messenger arrived, a dragon in human form, to avoid startling the settlement. He wore the deep blue robes of the royal household, and his eyes still held the gold-slit pupils of his true nature. Sienna watched him approach with curiosity but no fear. Are you Sienna Blackwood, daughter of Thomas Blackwood, the former royal gardener? His voice carried the formal tones of the palace, so different from the rough speech of Riverbend. Sienna nodded, her hands continuing their work with the roses. I bring a summons from the palace. Your presence is requested for a matter of great importance. He handed her a sealed letter bearing the imperial crest. Sienna wiped her hands on her apron before accepting the letter. She broke the seal and read quickly, her eyes widening with each line. The letter requested her skills as a communicator for a member of the royal family. It mentioned her grandmother's legacy, knowledge that should have been private. Someone had been watching her very carefully. When? She asked simply, her voice rusty from disuse. Immediately. Pack only what you need. A carriage waits in the village square. Sienna looked around at her garden, the cottage, the life she had built in solitude and peace. Something in her chest tightened at the thought of leaving, but beneath that fear ran a thread of curiosity. For years, she had wondered if her language of hands had any purpose beyond her own comfort. Perhaps now she would discover the answer. She nodded once and went inside to pack. First encounter. The Sapphire Palace was even more magnificent than the stories claimed. Sienna rode through gates carved from single pieces of azure crystal, past fountains that flowed with water that sparkled like liquid diamonds. Dragons in their true forms soared overhead, their scales catching the sunlight in dazzling displays. Human servants scurried through courtyards, keeping their eyes downcast in the presence of their dragon masters. High Priestess Morgana met Sienna in a chamber that seemed designed to intimidate. The ceiling soared 50 feet above, painted with scenes of dragon conquests. The furniture was sized for beings 3 times human height. Morgana herself had taken human form for the meeting, but her violet eyes and the faint shimmer of scales at her temples betrayed her true nature. Sienna Blackwood, Morgana's voice was surprisingly gentle. Thank you for coming. I understand your grandmother taught you a unique form of communication. Sienna nodded, her hands moving in a simple greeting that her grandmother had taught her as a child. The imperial family requires absolute discretion, Morgana continued. What I am about to tell you must never leave these walls. Do you understand? Another nod. Prince Casimir has never spoken. Not in 22 years. We have tried everything, consulted every expert in the empire. You are our final hope, though I confess I am uncertain how a human gardener might succeed where dragon scholars have failed. Sienna's hands moved in a question. Morgana watched, confused. I do not understand your gestures, child. Sienna pulled a small notebook from her bag and wrote quickly. May I ask questions? Of course. Can the prince hear? Does he understand speech? Yes to both. His mind is exceptional. He simply chooses not to speak, or cannot, we do not know which. Sienna wrote again. Has anyone tried teaching him another way to communicate? Morgana paused. We have offered him writing materials. He uses them rarely, only when absolutely necessary. He seems to resent the need. Perhaps he needs a language that is his own choice, not a compromise. Sienna's handwriting was neat despite the speed of her writing. The priestess studied the young human woman with new interest. You think you can reach him? Sienna wrote carefully. I think everyone deserves to be understood in the way that feels most natural to them. If you let me try, I will do my best. That evening, Sienna was led to the prince's quarters in the east wing of the palace. The corridors grew quieter as they walked, fewer servants, thicker carpets to muffle footsteps. The chambers themselves were beautiful but felt isolated, as though they existed apart from the rest of the palace. Prince Casimir sat by a window, staring out at the gardens below. Even in human form, his beauty was striking. Dark hair fell across a face carved from elegant angles, and those golden eyes reflected the sunset like molten metal. He did not turn when Sienna entered, though she was certain he knew she was there. Morgana made introductions that the prince ignored, then left them alone. Sienna stood uncertain for a moment, then did something that surprised even herself. She did not try to speak or gesture for his attention. Instead, she walked to the window and looked out at the same view he watched, letting the silence stretch between them comfortably. Minutes passed. The sun sank lower, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. Finally, Casimir glanced at her, curiosity flickering in those strange eyes. Sienna's hands moved slowly, deliberately. She signed a simple phrase in the language her grandmother had taught her. "The garden is beautiful at sunset." The prince stared at her hands. Then, for the first time in anyone's memory, Crown Prince Casimir responded. His movements were hesitant, unpracticed, but the meaning was clear. "Can you teach me?" Building bridges. The first weeks in the palace tested every bit of patience Sienna possessed. Prince Casimir was unlike anyone she had ever tried to help. He was brilliant but stubborn, curious yet guarded, desperately lonely while pushing everyone away. Their lessons took place in his private chambers, away from the prying eyes of the court and the expectations of his father. Sienna began with the basics, the foundational signs her grandmother had taught her as a child. Simple concepts like yes, no, please, thank you. Casimir absorbed them with startling speed, his hands mimicking her movements with increasing confidence. But he only signed when they were alone. The moment anyone else entered the room, his hands fell still and his expression closed like a door slamming shut. Why? Sienna signed to him one afternoon, 3 weeks into their work together. Why do you hide this from others? Casimir's golden eyes darkened. His hands moved in response, though he mixed several signs incorrectly in his frustration. They want me to speak. This is not what they want. This is communication, Sienna responded, her movements gentle but firm. This is valid. This matters. Not to them. Casimir stood and paced to the window, his human form tense with barely contained emotion. To them, I am broken. Defective. A prince who cannot give speeches or proclaim laws or inspire armies. They see only what I cannot do, never what I can. Sienna watched him carefully, then made a decision that could have gotten her thrown out of the palace. She walked to stand beside him and signed where he could see. Then they are fools. Casimir turned to stare at her, shocked that anyone would dare call the imperial court foolish, especially a human servant. But Sienna met his gaze steadily. You are not broken, she signed. You are different. There is power in that difference if you claim it instead of letting others define it for you. Something shifted in Casimir's expression. For the first time since she had arrived, he truly smiled. It transformed his face from beautiful to breathtaking, and Sienna felt her heart skip in a way that had nothing to do with their lessons. The garden lesson. Sienna convinced Morgana to let them take lessons outside, arguing that the prince needed environments that felt less confining. They began meeting in the royal gardens at dawn, when dew still clung to the flowers and the palace still slept. Here, with dirt beneath their feet and birdsong filling the air, Casimir seemed to breathe more easily. Sienna taught him signs for growing things, for the natural world that she loved. Flower, tree, butterfly, rain. Casimir learned eagerly, but he also began creating his own signs, modifications that felt more natural to his dragon instincts. Where Sienna signed rain with fingers fluttering downward, Casimir added a twisting motion that captured the way rain spiraled in dragon flight. Where she signed fire with flickering movements, he incorporated the depth and heat that dragons knew intimately. You are making the language your own, Sienna signed, delighted by his innovations. This is perfect. This makes it truly yours. They sat together beneath a willow tree, surrounded by roses that Sienna had planted years ago. Casimir's hands moved in a complex series of signs. You understand why I do not speak? It was the first time he had addressed the core issue directly. Sienna considered her response carefully before signing. I think you have your reasons. I would like to hear them, if you want to share. But you do not owe me explanations. Casimir looked at his hands, at these instruments that were finally allowing him to express himself. When I was young, they tried everything to make me speak. Punishments when I stayed silent. Rewards if I would just say one word. The priests said prayers over me. The physicians heard me looking for problems. The tutors shouted until I wished I could disappear. His hands trembled slightly as he continued. Every time they tried to force me, the words went further away. Until finally, there were no words at all. Only silence. And in that silence, I found peace. I found myself. But they called it defiance. They called it weakness. They called it a curse. Sienna felt tears prick her eyes. She reached out slowly, giving him time to pull away, and took one of his hands in both of hers. Not signing, just holding. I am sorry, she signed when she released him. That should never have happened to you. Do you think I am broken? Casimir asked, his hands forming the question with heartbreaking vulnerability. No, Sienna signed emphatically. I think you are brave. I think you protected yourself the only way you could. And I think anyone who cannot see your worth is not looking properly. Casimir stared at her for a long moment. Then he did something that startled them both. He reached out and touched her face gently, his fingers tracing the curve of her cheek with dragon grace. The touch sent electricity through Sienna's entire body. Thank you, he signed with his free hand, his golden eyes holding hers. For seeing me. The growing storm news of Sienna's progress with the prince had not spread far, but it had reached the emperor's ears. 4 months into her residency, she was summoned to the throne room. Walking through those massive doors felt like entering the maw of some great beast. Emperor Theron sat upon his throne in full dragon form, crimson scales gleaming like freshly spilled blood. You are the human who works with my son, Theron's voice was not a question. It rolled through the chamber like thunder before a storm. Yes, your majesty. Sienna kept her eyes lowered respectfully, her hands clasped in front of her to hide their trembling. High Priestess Morgana tells me you have made progress. That my son communicates with you. Prince Casimir has learned a form of gestural communication, your majesty. He is quite skilled at it. Can he speak? The emperor leaned forward, his massive head descending until Sienna could feel the heat of his breath. That is all I care about, human. Can my son speak? Sienna chose her words carefully. Prince Casimir is capable of speech, your majesty. Whether he chooses to speak is his decision. His decision? Theron's laugh was harsh and bitter. He is the crown prince. He does not have the luxury of decisions that suit his comfort. The coronation is in 8 months. By then, he must be able to proclaim the sacred oaths, or the council will have no choice but to pass the crown to his younger brother. This was news to Sienna. She had not known Casimir had a brother, much less that his throne was in such immediate jeopardy. Your Majesty, forcing Prince Casimir to speak against his will may do more harm than good. If you would consider allowing alternative methods of communication during the coronation, there are no alternative methods. The emperor's roar shook the very stones of the palace. 5,000 years of tradition dictate that the emperor must speak the oaths aloud. The magic that binds our people to the throne requires the royal voice. Without it, the coronation is invalid. Sienna stood frozen, realizing the true scope of the problem. This was not just about preference or comfort. This was about magic, tradition, and the stability of an empire. You have 4 months, human, Theron continued, his voice dropping to something more dangerous than his roar. 4 months to make my son speak. If you fail, you will be sent away with nothing. If you succeed, you will be rewarded beyond your dreams. But know this, the fate of our empire may rest on your success or failure. Truth and consequences. Sienna returned to Casimir's chambers shaking. He took one look at her face and signed immediately. What happened? She told him everything. The coronation deadline, the sacred oaths, the requirement for his voice, the threat to pass the crown to his brother. Casimir listened with growing fury, his golden eyes beginning to glow with the inner fire of his dragon nature. "They sent you to manipulate me," he signed, his movements sharp and angry. "To trick me into speaking by pretending to offer an alternative." "No," Sienna signed back firmly. "I knew nothing of this. I came to help you communicate, not to force you into anything. But now you know the truth. Now you know what they really want." Casimir paced the room like a caged predator. "You will try to convince me to speak. To abandon what we have built together. To become what they demand." Sienna stood and moved into his path, forcing him to stop. "I will do no such thing. What we have built is real and valuable, regardless of what anyone else wants." "But the coronation is your decision," Sienna interrupted, her hands firm in their movements. "Not mine, not your father's, not the Empire's. Yours." Casimir stared at her. "You would let me lose the throne rather than pressure me to speak?" "Yes," Sienna signed without hesitation. "Because your well-being matters more than a crown. Because you deserve to make choices about your own voice. Because I care about you, not about what you can do for your father or your empire." The words hung in the air between them, heavier than she had intended. Sienna had not meant to reveal so much, but there it was. The truth she had been avoiding for weeks now. "You care about me," Casimir signed slowly, his movements questioning. Sienna felt heat flood her cheeks, but she did not look away. "Yes. More than I should, probably. More than is appropriate for a gardener and a prince." Casimir closed the distance between them in 2 long strides. His hands came up to cup her face, tilting it so she had to meet his eyes. The gold in them swirled with emotions she could barely name. "I care about you too," he signed with one hand, the other remaining against her cheek. "You are the only person who has ever tried to understand me rather than fix me. You are the only one who makes silence feel like enough." When he kissed her, it was gentle and questioning, giving her every opportunity to pull away. Sienna did not pull away. She leaned into the kiss, into him, into the impossible situation they found themselves in. For a moment, there was no empire, no coronation, no expectations. There was only this. Impossible choices. The next 2 months passed in a blur of stolen moments and mounting pressure. Sienna and Casimir continued their lessons, but now something deeper ran beneath them. They communicated not just with signs but with touches, with glances, with the comfortable silence of 2 people who understood each other completely. But the coronation deadline loomed closer every day. The palace buzzed with preparations, and whispers about the crown prince's continued silence grew louder. Prince Davion, Casimir's younger brother, began appearing at court functions more frequently, his ruby scales gleaming as he gave speeches and charmed the nobility. The message was clear: the empire had an alternative if the eldest son proved insufficient. Sienna spent hours in the palace library, researching dragon magic and coronation rituals. There had to be another way, some loophole in the ancient laws that could allow Casimir to become emperor without speaking. But every text she found said the same thing: the emperor must speak the sacred oaths aloud, must proclaim the words that bound the magic of the throne to the ruler's will. "There has to be something we are missing," she signed to Casimir late one night in the gardens, their secret meeting place. "Some way to honor the tradition while acknowledging your needs." "There is no way," Casimir signed back, his movements heavy with resignation. "I have read every book, consulted every history. The oaths must be spoken, or the magic will not recognize the new emperor. Without that magic, the throne is just a chair. The emperor becomes just a figurehead." "Then we tell them that," Sienna insisted. "We explain that you communicate perfectly well, that you are intelligent and capable, that forcing you to speak is what they have always wanted," Casimir interrupted. "Sienna, I have fought this battle my whole life. They will never accept me as I am. To them, silence is weakness, and weakness has no place on the throne." Sienna took his hands in hers, holding them tightly. So what do we do? Let them crown your brother? Let everything you are be dismissed because of an ancient rule? Casimir looked at their joined hands, then up at the stars scattered across the night sky. I have been thinking about something. Something that terrifies me, but might be the answer. Tell me. What if I could speak, but chose not to? What if the problem is not that I cannot make sounds, but that words feel wrong? Like wearing clothes that do not fit, or speaking a language that is not quite right? Sienna considered this carefully. You think you could speak if you found the right words? I think I could try, Casimir signed slowly. But not their words. Not the speeches they write or the oaths they demand. My own words. In my own time. With someone I trust. Hope flickered in Sienna's chest. Would you try with me? Here, now, with no one else to hear? Fear crossed Casimir's face, but he nodded. Sienna waited, giving him space and time, her hands still holding his. Finally, after minutes that felt like hours, Casimir's throat worked. His lips formed sounds that were hesitant and rough, a voice unused to making words. But they were words nonetheless. Can you hear me? Sienna's eyes filled with tears. She squeezed his hands tightly and smiled. I hear you. Your voice is beautiful. Casimir laughed, and the sound was rusty but genuine. It feels strange. Like speaking underwater. You do not have to continue if it is uncomfortable, Sienna said aloud, giving him the option to return to signing. But Casimir continued speaking, the words coming easier now. No. I want to keep trying. With you, it feels safe. Like maybe I can be both things. Silent when I need to be, speaking when I choose to be. They sat together until dawn, Casimir practicing his voice while Sienna encouraged him. He told her about his childhood, about the pressure and fear that had silenced him. She told him about her grandmother, about learning that communication came in many forms. And slowly, word by word, Casimir reclaimed something he had locked away for 22 years. The coronation day. The morning of the coronation arrived with trumpets and ceremony. The entire empire seemed to hold its breath as nobles from across the 3 continents gathered in the crystal cathedral. Sienna watched from the gardens, forbidden to attend as a mere servant, her heart pounding with fear and hope. Casimir had told no one about his progress with speaking. Not his father, not the council, not even Morgana. He wanted the choice to remain his until the final moment. The night before, he had held Sienna close and signed against her shoulder. Whatever happens tomorrow, thank you for giving me back a choice. Now, standing in the gardens listening to the distant sounds of the ceremony, Sienna prayed to any god who might listen that Casimir would find the courage to speak. Not for the empire, not for his father, but for himself. Because he deserved to make that choice on his own terms. Inside the cathedral, Emperor Theron placed the ancient crown upon his son's head. The assembled nobility watched as the high priest began the ritual, calling upon Casimir to speak the sacred oaths that would bind him to the throne. The silence stretched. 1 second. 5 seconds. 10. Prince Davion stepped forward, ready to claim the crown if his brother failed. The council members shifted uncomfortably. Emperor Theron's face was stone, revealing nothing. Then Casimir raised his hands. Not to speak, but to sign. His movements were clear and deliberate, and though most of the assembly had no idea what they meant, the message was unmistakable. This was communication. This was his choice. I have been silent my whole life, Casimir's hands moved with grace and certainty. Not because I could not speak, but because speaking felt like wearing chains. You wanted me to be someone I was not. You wanted words that fit your expectations rather than truth that reflected my reality. A murmur ran through the crowd. Morgana stepped forward, ready to intervene, but Emperor Theron raised a claw to stop her. He was watching his son with an expression no one had seen before. Not anger, but something that might have been understanding beginning to dawn. Casimir continued signing. I learned another language. One that felt like freedom instead of imprisonment. One that let me be myself while still communicating clearly. And I learned it from someone who saw me as I am rather than as I should be. Then, and only then, did Casimir speak aloud. His voice rang through the cathedral, clear and strong despite years of disuse. But I also learned that being true to myself does not mean being only one thing. I can sign and speak. I can choose silence and choose words. I can be a prince who communicates differently and still be an emperor. He turned to face his father directly. So I will speak the sacred oaths, father. Not because you demand it, but because I choose it. And after this day, I will communicate in whatever way serves me and my people best. If the empire cannot accept an emperor who signs, then the empire must change. The cathedral fell absolutely silent. Every eye was on Emperor Theron. The ancient dragon studied his son for a long moment, seeing perhaps for the first time the strength in Casimir's difference rather than the weakness. Finally, Theron nodded. Speak the oaths, my son. Then rule as you see fit. Casimir spoke the sacred words, his voice growing stronger with each phrase. The magic of the throne recognized him, and the crown flared with golden light. He was emperor now, for better or worse. But he was emperor on his own terms. A new beginning. That evening, after the ceremonies and celebrations finally ended, Casimir found Sienna in the gardens. He was still wearing his coronation robes, the crown sitting heavy on his head. But his smile was genuine as he approached her. Emperor Casimir, Sienna said with a playful curtsy. How does it feel? Instead of answering aloud, Casimir signed. Strange. Terrifying. Right. All at once. You were magnificent today, Sienna signed back. You changed everything. We changed everything, Casimir corrected, speaking aloud now. You taught me that I could be both things. That choosing to speak did not mean abandoning who I am. He took her hands in his, and this time when he spoke, his voice was sure and clear. The empire will need to change many things if I am to be emperor. They will need to learn new ways of thinking about communication and difference and strength. But they will learn. I will make certain of it. What happens now? Sienna asked. Casimir smiled and signed his response, mixing words and gestures as felt natural to him. Now I need an advisor. Someone who understands communication in all its forms. Someone who is not afraid to tell an emperor when he is being foolish. Someone I trust completely. Are you offering me a position, Your Majesty? Sienna teased. I am offering you everything, Casimir said aloud, then signed, if you want it. Sienna looked at this impossible, beautiful man who had learned to be himself in a world that demanded conformity. She thought of her quiet garden, her simple life, the peace she had built in solitude. Then she thought of the adventure ahead, the chance to help change an empire's mind about difference and worth. Yes, she said aloud and signed simultaneously. I want it all. The Empire of Valdoria would face many challenges in the years ahead. Emperor Casimir would rule differently than any emperor before him, sometimes signing, sometimes speaking, always insisting that communication came in many valid forms. He would face opposition and resistance, but he would face it with Sienna at his side, helping him build bridges between the old ways and new possibilities. And in the royal gardens, where a mute prince first learned that his silence had value and a forgotten girl discovered her language had power, the flowers bloomed more beautifully than ever before. Because sometimes the most important revolutions begin not with grand speeches, but with gentle hands moving in the quiet spaces between words.